Junior Cycle History students, let's have a little look at the Home Rule Crisis 1912 to 1914. Home rule was a concept that Irish nationalists had been trying to have introduced in Ireland from the mid to late 19th century. And by the start of the 20th century, it finally looked like this was going to be a reality. This was going to happen for Ireland. Home rule is the idea that a parliament in Dublin would take care of small or domestic issues like education and healthcare, whereas the parliament in Westminster would still take care of the large issues like trade, taxation and war. Okay? For a lot of nationalists, this was seen as like a good compromise. Basically, it was the first step towards, some sort of Irish kind of self-governance, all right? After two failed attempts, by 1912, it finally looked like Ireland was going to get home rule. And the home rule crisis refers to a 2-year period of kind of tensions between nationalists and unionists over the potential introduction of home rule. Most nationalists were delighted by the prospect. It had been something they were working for, for the previous, 40 years, okay? Whereas unionists, on the other hand, were absolutely furious. So in 1910, the Liberal Party was in power in Britain, but they needed the support of the Home Rule Party to remain in power. In exchange for that support, the Liberal Party introduced the Third Home Rule Bill for Ireland in 1912. The Third Home Rule Bill proposed a parliament in Dublin to deal with internal affairs and a parliament in Westminster to deal with those larger external affairs that we mentioned. Something called the 1911 Parliament Act meant that the very conservative House of Lords could only delay the Home Rule Bill for 2 years, which meant that by 1914 Ireland would finally have a Home Rule Parliament. And Ireland had not had a parliament since the Act of Union in 1800. In 1912, the Third Home Rule Bill was introduced, and as I said, Unionists were not happy about this. Carson and Craig led huge demonstrations against Home Rule. They opposed Home Rule because they believed that Home Rule is Rome Rule. So what that means is they were concerned that under a Home Rule government, the Catholic Church would have more power, okay? And considering most Unionists were Protestant, they were really worried about being discriminated against and about being a minority in Ireland. And they were concerned about the control that the Catholic Church would have. Their other major issue with Home Rule was that they were really concerned that the industrial north part of Ireland would be ignored and forgotten about because the rest of the country was kind of more heavily reliant upon agriculture. In 1912, a document called the Ulster Solemn League and Covenant was signed by over 200,000 Unionists who swore to defend the union with Britain using all means necessary. Unionist women also signed a similar document. In 1913, the Ulster Volunteer Force, or the UVF, was formed. They were a paramilitary group that imported 35,000 guns through the port of Larne, and this was called the Larne Gun Running. Edward Carson, the guy we mentioned earlier, he also gave £10,000 to the UVF. In response to the creation of the UVF, in 1913, nationalists, led by Owen McNeill, they established the Irish version, which was the IVF, the Irish Volunteer Force. In 1914, the IVF, the Irish Volunteer Force, imported around 900 rifles and 25,000 rounds of ammunition through Howth, and this was called the Howth Gun Running. In the same year, we have the Curragh Mutiny. So British Army officers who were based in the Curragh in Kildare, they said that they would rather resign than enforce Home Rule in Ireland. A conference called the Buckingham Palace Conference was held to try and find a compromise between nationalists and unionists. However, this conference ended in failure. It looked like Ireland was headed towards civil war between nationalists and unionists over the introduction of Home Rule. In 1914, the Third Home Rule Bill became law, but it was immediately postponed until after World War I was over. Both nationalists and unionists agreed to help Britain during World War I. The idea being we're going to do everything we can to be as helpful as possible, keep Britain on side, so that when World War I is over, they'll either introduce Home Rule for us or, they won't, okay? A small group of nationalists, however, they viewed World War I differently. They saw England's difficulty as Ireland's opportunity. So basically, while England is busy fighting over in Europe, this is our chance to fight and win a republic. And so they planned the 1916 Rising instead.